Welcome to Ron B. Christian Talk on Race and Achieving Racial Equality. What I'm going to try to do today is, first of all, white America, black America, brown America, all races of America. We are so divided on race and racial issues in America and racism. We are so divided on that. A lot of people, and from my experience, it seems like a lot of white people are very uncomfortable to talk about race and racism. And that word racism seems to really create some emotions in people. All races. In some races, I can see from some of my friends that are black, Christian black friends, that anger comes about. We get angry when we're talking about race and racism with other races, mainly white people. And then white people that I'm noticing is there's emotions. And I put them in the category of maybe shame, guilt. And I strongly believe, and I strongly agree with the words of Martin Luther King on a speech he gave months before his death. This was after the civil rights victories, after the passing of civil rights bills. Martin Luther King said, "I don't see how we will ever solve the race issue in America until we have a search for the truth, a willingness to accept the truth, admit the truth when we discover it." And with the grace of God, that is my assignment today. Okay? We're going to talk a lot about how we interpret the world, and we're going to get to how we interpret racism in America. Whatever ethnic group you're in, whatever situations you come across, how do you interpret racism? We're going to talk about that today. Because I strongly believe to understand current conditions, we must look at the past and trace it to our current conditions so we can have transformative discussions instead of victim blaming. Okay? I'm going to start off with a quick story here. Picture this in a predominantly white neighborhood. Police officers can live there, and they can be your neighbors, they can be your friends, and you have a lot of interactions with these police officers. You see them at the grocery store, you see them at the ball games with your children, you see them dropping their kids off at school, you see them grocery stores shopping. You might say, "Hey, Officer Thompson, how you doing today? I like your wheels, like your cars. Oh, nice outfit." So you're going to have different social interactions with a police officer. So, that's going to be your surroundings. Your upbringing, your children will be in those neighborhoods and they'll see police officers. So that's how they're going to think when they see and hear about a police officer. The relationships you have will all help you interpret things, okay? This is our context, our surroundings, personal social interactions, our culture, our neighbors. This is how we interpret life. This is our context. Now let's picture an impoverished neighborhood. Most times, predominantly black neighborhood. In those neighborhoods, how is going to interactions with police officers? Okay, in those neighborhoods, it's going to be a lot of poverty, a lot of crime, a lot of stressful situations. Now, when a police officer shows up in those neighborhoods, he's not dropping his kids off to school. He's not, he's going to come in hot because it may be a hostile situation. So he's going to come in there, possibly gun drawn, because that's the nature of the situation, the nature of why he's coming to that community. That's the relationship he has with the community. Now, if you're born in that neighborhood, that's your upbringing, that's your social relationship, that's your culture, that's your life experiences. So you're going to interpret police officers from a whole different context. You see what I'm getting at? How important context is. That's how you interpret life. Okay? Context. Life preparation, culture, experiences, social relationships, surroundings, situations. This is how we interpret life. Okay? Also, we're going to talk about metaphors. Metaphor is a thing that is symbolic of something else. Okay? Let's break it down from a biblical perspective and then from a practical perspective. For all of us strong Christian leaders, scholars, pastors, bishops, let's look at this from a biblical perspective. Okay? What is the Bible? The Bible is an ancient collection of books written by men who lived at a specific time, came from a specific culture, surroundings. They had personal life experience that were unique to them. God prepared them for these tasks. This was a process. So their context was unique to them. And when they wrote, God inspired them. The Holy Spirit came into them and said, hey, I want you to use your context to write to the people here in your culture, in your time frame, from the context I've given you. So the key thing is to really understand the Bible. We must realize that the Bible was written for us and not to us. We must understand the context of the ancient Hebrew writers back then before we can interpret and apply it to our modern context. How many times you hear, you've taken it out of context? You know, husbands, I know you hear that a lot. I hear it from my wife. She'll say something. I'm like, hey, I'm quick to answer. I'm taking it out of context. That's what that means. Context is huge, and we're really going to get into that today. Ancient Bible writers had a context that is totally different from our modern context today. For example, John 6:48, I am the bread of life. Let's look at this metaphor, okay? Remember, metaphor is a thing that is symbolic of something else. And every culture, every race, every ethnic group has metaphors unique to their experience in their life. And if you don't understand that, it means something different from your culture. Let's look at this metaphor, okay? John 6:48, I am the bread of life. Jesus is not a loaf of bread that you can get from the grocery store or delivered from Uber Eats. It's not saying that. Everyone in that day, in that culture, in that surrounding, in that time frame, knew bread was essential to the Egyptian diet. You needed bread every day to survive. If you didn't have bread on a daily basis, you could die. Jesus is saying, I am the spiritual bread come down from heaven that satisfies completely and leads to eternal life. If you don't understand the context of the time of the biblical writers, it is easy to take a Bible verse or a metaphor out of context. Okay? Just recently, I heard an accurate teaching by a good friend of mine on Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you, not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. He did that thing. I got to hand it to him. He did a beautiful job. And why did he do a beautiful job? Because I talked to him afterwards. I knew the answer, but I wanted to talk to him just to reinforce what I was getting ready to say today. He says, yeah, Ron, a lot of people take that Bible verse out of context. A lot of people will take that Bible verse when they're celebrating something like graduating from high school or college. Okay, where am I going next? It's a great time that you're celebrating. And what am I going to next? But he says, that's not that Bible verse. I said, explain it to me. He says, that Bible verse is when God's people were taken captive and they were in Babylon. They were longing to go back home, but it was a tough time and they're going to have to stay there a while. And so that Bible verse was given to them by Jeremiah to give them hope that things will get better. But I said, hey man, great job on that. You know why? Because he knew the context of the Bible verse. He knew from Genesis all the way to Jeremiah, he knew God's Edenic plan. And he knew God allowed his people to be captive because of their disobedience. But God had a plan to rescue them. He knew the theology and everything behind that Bible verse. It was amazing. So, as Christian people, as all of us, we need to understand race and how it started in this country. If not, we could take it out of context. We have to do what my friend did. Hey, I've got to understand from the beginning what happened. I can't just look in and look at race right now and say, oh, this is what's going on. Understand the history of race in America. And that's what we're going to really get into, okay? We must be able to trace our past into the present because it gives us all a similar way, context, to view the current conditions of race in America, which should position us to have transformative discussion rather than victim blaming or denial. Denial. One trick of the enemy, trick of Satan, is to fool Christian people that he doesn't exist. Or to make he thinks, oh, I've got a tail, I got my red suit on, I got my horns, I got my pitchfork. And he gets away with it. A lot of us, a lot of people will deny it, don't think he exists, so he can sneak around and do his dirt. And we have to understand, just like God's people under Moses and eventually Joshua, when they came into the promised land, that God had a plan for them. When they came into the promised land, they had physical enemies and they had spiritual enemies. For us to really attack and conquer this racial problem, we have to understand it's spiritual and physical. But we have to learn the truth, okay? Some of us may know the truth of history of race in America because you are the one telling the history. We all have a tendency to make ourselves the hero and exaggerate some parts of the story. So we may know the truth. We may not know the truth. And the truth you know was edited and written by people who had liberty to exaggerate parts of the truth. Because when you tell the truth, you're going to make yourself the hero. As an example, my wife, she grew up in Tallahassee, Florida. Me, I grew up in San Antonio, Texas. Played a little sports, but when I tell my wife my history, because she wasn't there, man, I should be in the NFL. And because I'm going to exaggerate some parts of the truth and maybe deny some of the stuff that I might have set the bench a lot. So, common. And that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the truth of race in America. That's where we're getting ready to get into. Let's define the meaning of racism and how we want to use it in our discussion today. First of all, Robert Morris, a pastor out of Texas, does an excellent job on discussing race from the pulpit. I will put a link at the bottom of this video, but you can also look it up. You can Google it, Robert Morris and race. He's got a long version, a little bit over an hour. Also, he's got a short clip for like 34 minutes. I really recommend that you look at that. But we're going to find racism on how we want to use it in our lesson today. I think there's three categories of racism, or three ways to categorize racism. Number one, racism, hating a person because of their race. And unfortunately, I think it's some demonic forces out there that some people just hate another person, another group of people, just because they're different than them. Okay? Number two, believing that one race is superior to another race, that group of people do not look like me, their skin color is different, so they're inferior to me. And number three, prejudice towards another race, making prejudgment about another person without knowing the facts. In my ventures and experiences, That may be the majority of people, but there's people in every category. And we're going to get to the root of that today. Why is it when we talk about racial issues in America, it seems to be the polar extremes are white on one side, black on the other side? Yes, there's racial division and issues between all races, some, but it seems to be the polar extremes are black and white. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about how that is so far from what God intended in the Bible. We all come from Adam and Eve. God did not create a racial divide. God did create diversity. Diversity in skin color. In Acts 13:1, we read, "Now there were in the church at Antioch prophets and teachers, Barnabas, Simeon, who was called Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, Manon, a lifelong friend of Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul." Niger means black, and Cyrene is a North African nation. So right there, we see back in biblical times, some of the early prophets and teachers in the church of Antioch were men of color. So how did we get so far from what the Bible says, what the Bible infers, what the Bible tells us, all the way to this racial issue and divide we have in America, with white and black being the polar extremes? In the early colonial period, Europeans came to America to build a nation of equality, liberty, and justice for all. Due to the terrible economic conditions in Europe due to the 30-year war, which is actually a religious war, don't have time to discuss it here, but you can Google and look it up if you don't know it. Many skilled and unskilled workers were without jobs back in Europe. So they wanted to come and get a new start here in this new world, the American colonies. But unfortunately, 1/2 to 1/3 of the immigrants who came to the American colonies arrived as indentured servants. Very important to understand indentured servants because it plays a vital part in our history. Indentured servants was a person who came to America, didn't have the money to come to America, or didn't want to use their money to come to America, the American colonies. So they got in contact with a company or a group of people or person that was here that say, hey, if you come over to America, I will pay for you to come here, you and your family, and then I'll give you a contract, usually 4 to 7 year contract. You sign this contract. I will give you room and board, give you a place to work. Then after the contract, I will give you 25 acres, a year worth of food. I'll give you a cow, and you'll get some land. You know, you got 25 acres, so you can start fresh. Seemed like a pretty good idea. So 1/3 to 1/2 of the immigrants who came to America came as indentured servants. Signed a contract, usually 4 to 7 years, then you can get your freedom, basically. Now, there were laws in place to give them rights. So they were indentured servants. They were not slaves. The life of an indentured servant could be harsh. You know, you got restrictions, but there were laws passed to protect you and give you rights. In 1619, the first black Africans came to Virginia. They came as indentured servants, not slaves. But unfortunately, a short time after that, well, in 1641, a few years later, laws were passed, and the little bit of freedom that a black African had was taken away. Now he was a slave. There were laws passed that said just because you're black, just because you're a black African, just because you're in this country, you are a slave, which means you are property. Means a person, the planter elite, the white landowner, owns you, your property, own you as property, own your family, own your children, the next generation. So now you are in bondage for the rest of your life just because you're black. very key point. Now, this is important. So on a plantation, you could have three different groups of people. You could have indentured servants, you could have slaves, and also you could have what we'll classify as poor white people. And these were people that were former indentured servants. Things didn't go well with their 25 acres, or there wasn't land available, which we'll talk about later. So they were on this plantation too. So you had three different groups of people. Okay. The demand for land. Now, these colonies, these settlements started off as small, but now as time went on, these plantations grew. Now, the demand for land was achieved by invading and conquering larger territory. And the American Indians became an obstacle for the land greed to these white Europeans. So the media of that day, books, newspapers, and magazines created images of the American Indians as savages, a lesser race, thus providing justification for the extermination and killing off of the native people in order to get their land. As the demand for land increased, guess what? The demand for labor grew as well. And the indentured servant process became expensive, because as you got more indentured servants, oh man, I got to pay out. Every 4 to 7 years, I got to pay out. I got to pay out. I got to pay out 25 acres. I got to pay out a cow. I got to pay out a year's worth of food. I've got a new clothes. I had to pay this out. So the Southern governments would invent creative ways to extend the indentured servant's servitude so it was longer for them to get paid. And they would do creative ways. You know, you didn't get along with people. That's out of your contract. I didn't like the way you communicated with certain groups of people, so I would extend your contract. Needless to say, this created an animosity from the slaves, who were already in bondage for life, so they weren't happy. You had the indentured servants who were being taken advantage of, and now you had the poor whites that were former indentured servants. But here's what was going on, was getting them upset. This planter elite, this white social class, what they were doing now were getting large land grants and buying up all the land. So now when you are finished being an indentured servant, there wasn't land to be given to you because they had owned it all and they bought it all up. So needless to say, it created some animosity towards the planter elite. Now this created the right atmosphere for what we're going to call the Bacon Rebellion. There's different historical interpretations of the Bacon Rebellion, so we're going to talk about it and just deal with the basics of the facts concerning the Bacon Rebellion. Nathan Bacon was a white property owner in Jamestown, Virginia. Bacon developed a plan to seize American Indian land, to increase land ownership for himself and others, to reduce the threat of Indians' raids. That was his theme. That was his business plan, basically. The planter elite did not support him by not supplying militia support, so Bacon was upset. He was pissed. He planned a revolt and attack on the planter elite's homes and properties. Bacon was able to unite the slaves, indentured servants, and poor white people in an effort to overthrow the planter elite. The overthrow was not successful, and many of the participants were hanged. But what did this do? This created an absolute fear in the minds and hearts of the planter elite, the plantation owners. They were afraid of the multiracial alliance of the indentured servants and the slaves, or the poor white people and slaves. Scared them to death. In order to protect their superior economic status and position themselves that way, they deliberately and strategically implemented a plan called a racial bribe. Okay, what's a racial bribe? Here's what they did. The planner elite gave special privilege to poor white people in an effort to drive a wedge between them and the slaves. Now, white settlers, immigrants, were allowed greater access to Native American lands. White servants were allowed to police slaves through slave patrols and militias. Now, poor whites had a stake in a permanent race-based slavery system. By the mid-1700s, the system of indentured servants had been thoroughly transformed into a racial caste system predicated on enslaving black people. The degraded status of Africans were justified on the grounds that Negroes were an uncivilized race even less than the red-skinned Native Americans. The language of the Constitution was deliberately colorblind. The words slave or Negro were never used. The document was built and written upon compromise to support a racial caste system. Upon the terms of our founding fathers and the founding document, slaves were defined by 3/5 of a person. Upon this racist fiction is how American democracy was built. Wow, enlightening. Now we see how important it is. And I want to thank you for listening. I want to thank you for helping me, attending me, listening to this journey. Because now we see the importance of looking at our past, racial situation, what it was founded on, the racial inequalities, the racial injustices, on how this country was built, connecting it and tracing it to our current conditions. Thank you for joining me along this search for the truth. Now, I hope and pray that we accept this truth, because that's important. It's important because this is the process we need to start having transformative conversations instead of finger pointing, because this is going to be the start, and this is going to show us and enlighten us on our God-given responsibility, accountability as Christian people, as leaders, members of society, in order to build the future and bring racial equality. Thank you very much. See you next time.